actually dropping this Friday, looming, with the stock market sort of reeling with all of these brand new calls for trimming your portfolio and taking your profits. We have a stock market that's stalled out. We have interest rates that aren't budging due to fears in Iran. And today's topics are a little bit more personal. So, you may have heard of the Lego scandal that is sort of sweeping social media. There's something like what's quoted as $200,000 worth of stolen Legos, something like under $100,000 what's actually been verified as missing. If you look into CoffeeZilla's recent video on what he can find in terms of the data, it seems to us, it seems to the world that perhaps there's the $200 headline, $200,000 headline, certainly clickbait, and I don't disagree with that. It's certainly a YouTuber style to talk things up in the biggest possible way, and that was the biggest possible number at one point. But so let's drill down into it: the Lego scandal and how that relates to real estate. In my experience, I've been a general manager and an operations manager of a restaurant, and it was a franchise, and we had corporate over us dictating, the flow of things and the rules and all that good stuff. And whenever we produced for corporate, they went ahead and took credit for it. However, there would be many an opportunity for corporate to go ahead and say, well, that franchise was not functioning properly, and therefore it's their fault. So, in the Lego scandal, you have, unfortunately, a Lego franchise store that was taken over by corporate. And unfortunately, in this takeover, a consignment deal that had been made between a patron, the gentleman with the largest Lego Star Wars collection ever, had done a consignment deal with this Lego franchise's Bricks and Minifigs location, which is a resale location for Legos. They had done a consignment deal, and some portion of the Legos have been sold. And now at this point, as the franchise was being taken over by corporate was then taking responsibility for the unsold Legos, right? But unfortunately, in this exchange, corporate decided, or the franchisee that was taking over for corporate from the original franchisee, someone in there wasn't being honest. Somebody in there went ahead and grabbed up all of those Legos and never gave them back to the victim, named Brian Mansell, I believe. Unfortunately, this leaves Brian Mansell out of some portion of his Legos, which is not very well documented. Corporate comes in and says, we don't do consignment deals. That franchise is doing the wrong thing. It's their fault. That's part of the reason we fired them. Turns out that because of leaked documents, we can tell that Bricks and Minifigs does indeed do consignment deals. At least they were allowed to at the time. Were they discouraged? What was the exact deal between corporate and this franchise? We do know that this franchise and corporate worked together on the advertisement of this giant, the largest Star Wars collection that has ever been placed together by one person. And so we know there was collusion between corporate and the franchise. And at that point, we know that not only is corporate aware of this, but they've allowed it, and it's tacit permission, if nothing else. However, we do know that there was actual permission based on the leaked rules. So, Bricks and Minifigs says, no, we don't have your stuff anymore. That was an old deal that, from what we can tell, was paid out. You can sue us for it. that was the franchise, the new franchisee that said that, right? And then corporate essentially collaborates that, and now we have the original owner who's written off on consignment all of these Legos, giving fighting for custody from the franchise, the new franchisee, who's shielding corporate, saying corporate, or rather is using corporate, saying corporate was the one who allowed this. Corporate has, you have to talk to corporate to get your Legos, right? And corporate says, well, that's the franchisee, you'll have to talk to them. And so they're back and forth. And when you finally get to the bottom of it, it seems, and there's a lot of stuff out there, it seems that both sides are suing each other. They've blamed the YouTuber named Reckless Ben, who is the the uh, the YouTuber that got most involved in terms of trying to get Brian's Legos back. And unfortunately, Reckless Ben, he's being sued. He's got an injunction against his speech now, so he's no longer able to speak about it. So this is the story essentially, right? We have a gentleman who had his father had collected the largest Lego set ever in terms of Star Wars. And then, unfortunately, a new franchisee kicking out an old franchisee based on corporate's ruling and dictate. And this new franchisee says to the original owner, Brian, that these are no longer his Legos, or that they're no longer there, or that they can't have them. They'll have to sue. And so, essentially, Brian screwed. The new franchise is forcing Brian to sue for more than the Legos would be worth ultimately in terms of court fees. And then lastly, you've got corporate that says, oh, it's franchise's fault. We don't do consignments, and yeah, talk to them. This situation sucks. And I can tell you how it relates to my life in terms of being a franchisee for so many years in the restaurant business. Unfortunately, it is the truth that people are going to take advantage of the fact that there's a degree of separation between the franchisee and the franchisor. I mean, yes, there are rules that allow for one to do consignment deals, but there's just enough ambiguity and proprietary knowledge in order to play the public essentially and make it seem as though there are opportunities perhaps that there are not for a franchisee, or rather that the franchisee may have gone above and beyond what they were allowed to do. And so that, unfortunately, and that ambiguity and that ability for franchisor and corporate to blame each other and to not take responsibility is exactly what allows people to get away, at least in perception, and maybe in reality, with their mistakes, their crimes. It can really suck in a lot of ways. But here's how it relates to real estate. In my experience, in my recent experience, I had an agent who was on the seller side of a transaction. He is trying to sell this house that's a little bit older, and it has a whole bunch of, let's say, modifications done to it. It's got some new walls. It has some new air conditioning units. And my buyers are very concerned about whether or not this be an issue in terms of permitting and if it was all done properly. And so we look into it, and we find that we can't pull a single permit per county or city or public records. There's nothing in terms of building on this property. So we asked the agent himself, and he says, "Oh, yeah, no, it's the contractors said we're good. We don't need permits. The licensed contractors, the franchisees, said we're good. That's on them. If we needed permits, but we don't, because they said we're good and we're fine." So, and that degree of separation allows this realtor to lie to me essentially and tell me that we're good. We don't need permits. And how did I find out we're lying? I talked to the city. The city says, hey, you do need a permit. You need a permit for anything that you build that isn't redoing the same structure essentially. If you're I think they said something like if you're redoing your windows, or if you're putting in maybe like you're fixing a wall and replacing it, but it's the same wall, right? These things maybe don't need permits. Check with your city. But the point is that there's clearly a miscommunication somewhere in there, or somebody's going shady. But I think the thing that's super shady is the idea that you can go ahead and blame your contractors. It's not your fault. It definitely, you didn't choose this. You wouldn't take advantage of people and sell them a house that doesn't, require, or that does need permits but doesn't have them, right? Which can be an issue for homeowners insurance if your home burns down and they find out there were unpermitted add-ons, right? It can be an issue for the county assessor. The fact that maybe you want to be honest and you're not reporting all this new square footage, which is clearly an issue. So that's another way that this real estate agent was being shady. Now you got this agent who's upset that I'm questioning him, trying to get to the bottom of whether this home is done legally so I can sell my buyers a home that isn't going to give them a headache in the long run, that isn't going to need to be torn apart because maybe it wasn't done properly by licensed contractors that said they were good to not get permits. But but again, they were using that degree of separation, the real estate agent, the contractors, etc., in order to obfuscate the blame. And so you have to do your research, and you can't trust somebody who's blaming another person in terms of whether or not even just blaming, but somebody who's using another person in order to shield themselves from any possible blame or responsibility. Because ultimately, I think the point of these two stories is that the responsibility is going to be ultimately on the owner and and corporate in Bricks and Minifigs situation, um, and the seller in this case, the seller who's aware that they're relying on contractors that said they didn't need permits when they never talked to the city, and so they don't actually have a great idea as to whether or not they do. And we know they're being shady because they haven't updated the square footage and paid the taxes appropriate for the square footage. It's there are so many opportunities for people to always blame others. And I think in this society, the only way we're going to rebuild high trust or maintain it, if you feel like you have it, is in is a world in which we don't blame others but blame ourselves, take full responsibility. And in my situation, personally, I can tell you that when I ran a restaurant, everyone in that restaurant was my responsibility. It did not matter whatsoever that folks in that restaurant were that the people I hired were not always of my mind, right? I didn't have full control over what they do. I could only train them to do what they were supposed to do, supervise, coach, set expectations and goals, right? And those things I did, all the time, were my responsibility. But I'll tell you what also is my responsibility, unfortunately, as a leader and somebody who is training and in a place of authority, is everything that your people do. I don't care if it's selling a house and you've got contractors that were wrong about the way the permit structure was done. That's your responsibility. I don't care that you hired a franchisee that went ahead and didn't make good on their deals, that maybe even did deals that were against corporate policy. That's your responsibility for hiring that franchisee and allowing for them to have that opportunity to do the wrong thing. And when I hire somebody who goes ahead and hired somebody who goes ahead and makes a sandwich or makes a steak and makes something that's not up to par for a customer, that's their fault. That's the employee's fault. That's my fault. I trained them. I hired them. I allowed them the opportunity to make that mistake for a customer who's paying for the typical and standard quality, right? And so I think if there's one thing I can emphasize, it's simply that take responsibility. The people under you are still your responsibility. High trust comes from taking responsibility. And we can have that high trust aside. So that is how I sort of pair the two topics, Legos and real estate. Here in the Tucson market right now, we're seeing some pretty slow sales, especially going into summer. The average days on market are around 60 days. However, people are getting around 98% of what they're asking for. And sales, while they're slowing, they really haven't dipped all that much. Personally, in my experience, every transaction I've gone into expects to take an additional 5% hit or so on the sales price, including concessions. So there's definitely some leverage in the Tucson market. So that's it. That's all I got for you. Take responsibility. Hopefully the Lego situation gets resolved and